Story 1. People were not very informed back then. We would never be deceived by those untrustworthy politicians or be unaware of the realities of scientific discovery. Story 2. I believe that the ability of artificial intelligence to generate images and text will make it impossible for anyone other than highly trained historians with extensive experience in museum collections to have any understanding of past events. People may not even comprehend what is happening in the world during their own time period. Story 3. Because people did not like pronouns in emails or paper straws, they decided to elect the person who would harm the economy. Story 4. They will say that this is when the backlash against civil rights and women's rights reached its ultimate battle. They will learn that no Democratic candidate for president has won the white vote since the mid-1960s. Not one. And no Republican candidate has won the black vote for a long time. This is when a significant segment of white America turned against the government they felt had betrayed them. This is why we have inadequate health care, low minimum wages, poor retirement plans, high unemployment rates, insufficient family leave, and all the other issues that other countries seem to manage better. We decided that rather than support our black neighbors, we would drain and permanently fill in the public pool. Then one day, after many of us were becoming more progressive with each passing decade, a black family was in the White House for 8 years. Democrats seemed likely to put a woman in the presidency next. Plus, LGBTQ individuals can get married now. Then along came Donald Trump. His open racism and misogyny signaled that he would champion a fading way of life for Republicans. White men in control of everything, women and people of color knowing their place, and LGBTQ individuals becoming invisible again. Now that they have realized they can't reliably win based on these outdated views in an increasingly diverse and egalitarian country, they have decided to do away with democracy and attempt to establish minority rule. That is what they will say and learn about this time in school in 100 years. Story 5. The internet was ultimately one of the most harmful inventions in history. America was, ironically, invaded, dominated, and ended by foreigners. Story 6. They will remember what we are living through right now, as we remember Hitler's rise to power. They will likely ask why no one did anything to stop what is happening. Story 7. Honestly, they look back at this time as the dawn of what would become the next modern world. With artificial intelligence, space travel, and the internet, they will likely view it as a period of great innovation and chaotic transition. As Michio Kaku said, transitioning from Type 0 to Type 1 civilization is the most important yet most dangerous step. Story 8. The Democrats and the people should have fought back harder. Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and others should all be behind bars for corruption and treason, serving life sentences. Story 9. They will look at this time like we look back at these people. Such obviously vile individuals, but at the time they had supporters. That girl seething at the black girl going to school represents the attitudes of the 1950s and 1960s. Story 10. They won't say anything. They will ask a platform like Reddit or an AI tool to summarize information and present it as a random thought. Someone from the future. Story 11. What a disaster. How could they allow that to happen? We would never let an authoritarian take control of our country like that. Story 12. History is told by those in power, the winners, so it is often presented in a way that favors them. Story 13. People will say that it is important to learn about the 2020s and 2030s to avoid repeating the same mistakes. Story 14. Merrick Garland is compared to Neville Chamberlain and Judas Iscariot. History remembers a coward. Story 15. It will follow the usual pattern. Several books will be written about the mistakes made and how this came to be. Then, after some time, the revisionists will have their say and try to rehabilitate Donald Trump or at least parts of his administration. Eventually, we will settle into the established perspective. I sincerely believe that it will be viewed as a negative point in our history, one we should be deeply ashamed of. There will always be a small but vocal minority who claims that Trump was either a misunderstood genius who didn't implement his policies properly or was obstructed by people who didn't understand. Story 16. Nothing. They will just shudder quietly to themselves, offer thanks for their salvation, and move on. Story 17. If I were alive then, I would have stood up for vulnerable groups. Probably a 10-year-old learning about a mass casualty for the first time. Story 18. Most of today's silent bystanders will claim they were fiercely protesting the genocide of the indigenous people of Palestine. Likewise, they will also claim they protested when Israeli lobbyists and top donors made the United States override the First Amendment. As for the deteriorating environment, most will say they had no idea. Story 19. I appreciate your optimism about future generations being able to reflect on this time. Story 20. I hope people will look back and recognize that they were used to things getting worse in many areas. It took one unrepentant individual to demonstrate just how bad it could get. However, I hope that everyone came together and decided to do better, preventing a few from dominating the many. That's what I hope they will say. That's probably the best case scenario. Story 21. They will consider all the historians who discuss the gradual decline of civilizations, often due to external forces, and disregard their work. Then, they will formulate a new theory to explain why we caused our own downfall intentionally and twice. Story 22. Same thing we say about the 1950s and 1960s. Those were the good old days. It is all the product of a short memory. Story 23. It is difficult to know what future humans will value about us. Based on our current values, they may be confused by the contrast between our technological achievements and the art we celebrated. This, of course, depends on which art endures over time. However, I believe that outside of a few select works, there is not much art worth remembering. Story 24. Our ancestors will be sitting at their favorite American restaurant chain. During appetizers, one of them will say, "Remember all that stuff that happened about 100 years ago?" Another will respond, "Oh yeah, I know this one," while raising their chicken wing in the air to be met with a round of wing toasts. I know what I'm doing. Story 25. They will not look back because the past will no longer exist. It will be redacted, revised, and reissued under state-approved context. History will be a fluid script, updated nightly by committee. Memory will be considered treason. Nostalgia will be seen as a malfunction. They will not ask what we thought. They will be told what we meant. Story 26. Dark populism and nationalism are the results of extreme income inequality, combined with the power to control the narrative. Story 27. Maybe what we say about 1940, which is the last time that the United States almost fell under the control of fascists. Story 28. Humanity has the potential to thrive together, but we allow the powerful to keep us divided, trading progress for profit and knowledge for control. Story 29. If we align cyclical events, history will focus more on the events that follow. The Great Depression and two world wars are far more interesting than the few individuals and decisions that initiated that chain of events. The main question is who is writing the history books and who is left to read them. Story 30. This was caused by something called social media, which allowed social and political manipulation at scale. Story 31. We have a recency bias in that we are witnessing chaos in real time, leading us to feel that civilization is ending. In the future, it will likely be a footnote, as future generations will have their own challenges to face. Story 32. People will talk about the United States like we talk about the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The United States is going to collapse under itself if it doesn't rise up. The metaphor of frogs boiling in a pot is a perfect example of what is happening in the United States. Story 33. There will not be historical records for this moment in history, at least in the United States, because they are not keeping any. Story 34. The rise and exponential growth of artificial intelligence in recent years has been remarkable. It is difficult to predict what the landscape will look like in a decade. We may even be able to generate our own movies featuring our choice of actors. Story 35. Why did they use all the natural resources, overfish the seas, destroy the forests, and manipulate rivers so recklessly? Story 36. Since we tend to look to the past with nostalgia and hyperfocus on the things that have worsened, I think people will view this time with a positive feeling, as if we are in the 1940s of this century. Story 37. You assume humans will survive this time in history. They just brought back dire wolves. There isn't any surviving this. Story 38. The past was full of absurdity and suffering before extraterrestrials arrived and enhanced our minds. I can dream. Story 39. If the worst-case scenario occurs, with people who were persecuted still alive, the situation will be well documented, especially outside of the devastated region that will be the United States. We also benefit from greater visibility with the internet and the prevalence of cameras. I believe those of us who are not willfully ignorant will be aware of what transpired and will agree that this administration's actions, driven by the petty revenge of a narcissist suffering from dementia, who is being manipulated by another global power and motivated by the enrichment of his supporters, represent a dark chapter in history. Story 40. I really wonder what it was like to actually play all of those games. It's unfortunate that they all began focusing on game designs that were necessarily transient. Story 41. They will look back at the destruction of the Library of Alexandria today and ask, what was that for? What did that gain? Story 42. And the Americans wondered how the Germans allowed the situation to escalate. Little did they know they were about to make history in the worst way possible. This perspective comes from a history book in the United Kingdom, as this history was prohibited from being written about and removed from all libraries. Story 43. Turmoil has engulfed the United States. The taxation of trade routes to outlying penguins is in dispute. Hoping to resolve the matter with a blockade of deadly battleships, the U.S. government has stopped all shipping to the small islands of Heard and McDonald. While the Congress endlessly debates this alarming chain of events, the president has secretly dispatched two reality TV stars, the guardians of peace and justice in the world, to settle the conflict. Story 44. When they discover the remnants of Mount Rushmore, the Hoover Dam, and the interstate highway system, the Americantologists will promote the narrative that we were never an advanced civilization and built everything with hand tools. Conspiracy theorists will argue that this was only possible after rogue time-traveling descendants of Elon Musk returned to Earth from their Mars colony, made contact with primitive people, and shared advanced technology that had been lost over time. Story 45. They will look back, if they do, and say this is when we lost the ability to differentiate between what is real and true and what isn't. The ability to distort truth and reality through constant propaganda and artificial intelligence deepfakes on the internet and around-the-clock news is a far more devastating weapon than people realize. Story 46. They will say we were naive to allow social media, talk radio, and cable television personalities to pit us against each other. Story 47. I think they will ask how Trump could have been allowed to run for office after leading a violent attack on the Capitol, a coup in order to illegally remain in office. Story 48. They caged, raped, and tortured animals in the hundreds of millions as if that was acceptable. What a bunch of savages. Story 49. They will wonder how the world allowed the wealthiest 1% to manipulate the 30% minority on each side of the political spectrum into such stark partisanship. Story 50. Man, we were foolish. I can't believe we used common household objects that are secretly poisonous on a daily basis. Story 51. They will have numerous historical documents and sources to work with, resulting in a completely different approach to processing and studying history. It would be fascinating. Entire classes and possibly fields of study will be dedicated not only to analyzing how the political opinions and ideological alignments of our time were formed, but also to the systems that propagated them. They will study how online threads, like those on Reddit, function as both echo chambers and societal release valves. Research papers will compare different media forms of our era, including cable news networks and their more extreme successors, the rise of progressive left independent outlets, and social media short-form content platforms, all of which have influenced voting patterns among various demographics. They will analyze how, whenever someone makes a succinct comment on a discussion platform about a controversial action taken by a political figure, they are expressing their political dissatisfaction. However, in the pursuit of upvotes or likes, they often become so engrossed that it diminishes their political will to engage in advocacy and vote for representatives who align with their views. Academic debates will arise regarding audience capture versus the concept of the bully pulpit and manufactured consent, highlighting the complexities of the information age. There may be individuals who latch onto the most unconventional ideas of today's society, whose associated policies are currently in practice, and whose long-term consequences will be felt far into the future. They will be ridiculed by mainstream society until they are suddenly accepted. The theory of a declining internet may become a significant topic of discussion. There could be museums dedicated to social media platforms, beyond just showcases of early computers, but also exhibits narrating how influential figures utilize these platforms to advance their political agendas, or how high-profile legal battles reshaped the landscape of information sharing. Alternatively, we may find ourselves in a dystopian future where these materials are unavailable to our descendants. Nonetheless, I hope that some archivist uncovers this commentary and recognizes our anxieties today, allowing future students to understand the gravity of our current situation. They may need to do some research to learn who Tim Pool is. Story 52. Poor people denied opportunity and autonomy reacted by electing individuals to burn down the castles. In America, the wealthy financed Donald Trump and ensured there was nothing in his way to prevent him from doing their bidding. Instead, he destroys the foundation of the United States to enrich himself. The greatest financial losses due to his actions have come from the rich. The public, hungry for vengeance, celebrates unaware of their own losses. How we reflect on this will largely depend on the outcome. If the powerful learn a lesson and decide to share a portion of their wealth, perhaps future generations will view this positively. If the powerful cannot find any kindness in their hearts and the dreams of a perfect society on Earth or a new planet to dominate prove to be foolish, then perhaps future generations will view this negatively. Story 53. Ideally, people back then were brilliant. Story 54. It will be compared to the first sack of Rome and the fall of the Roman Empire. Trump will be compared to Nero, whose behaviors, including self-indulgence, perceived obsession with personal brand, and hunger for revenge, show him to be a narcissist. History will not be kind to Trump. Story 55. Can you believe people used to drive all vehicles themselves? Imagine giving anyone the ability to control a 1-ton vehicle traveling at 100 kilometers per hour. It's incredible that this was ever permissible. Story 56. Were there so many people who disliked so few that they elected former President Donald Trump to lead America? The opposition to transgender rights was not about promoting women's sports, but about excluding a handful of individuals from participating. Some may believe that the Industrial Revolution was a significant mistake due to the waste it produced, while we could have been living in harmony with the planet without the need to learn about taxes. Story 57. They were incredibly selfish, consigning humanity to 2 centuries of struggle to repair the planet. This outcome could have been avoided with a small lifestyle change made between 1980 and 2010, such as choosing to take the train or convert to electricity. Story 58. People had no lives back then, triggered by every little thing and a herd mentality online that sent them into spasms of social outrage. Story 59. Remember that time America essentially turned into South Park and made Idiocracy look like a documentary? Story 60. The alpha and beta generations have caused significant issues. Why can't they just step aside and leave us what they have? Story 61. They will say, too bad they burned all the books, destroyed the environment, and caused mass extinction. We can see some ruins from their civilization, but it looks nothing like the information we deciphered from the probe floating in space. There is a lot of digital gibberish, but whoever they were, they must not have been very bright. Thank goodness there are a few surviving whales to shed some light on their species. Story 62. I don't have an answer, but looking at history has been strangely comforting. People in the past have lived through much upheaval. I know many have died or will die from the incompetence and actions of the current Republican Party. I hope this will be a major turning point in history towards something better. Maybe I'm naive, but it's good to sometimes consider the long-term perspective. Story 63. In a world history class, the events of September 11th, global warming, and the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine will likely be the only noteworthy topics from the last 25 years. Frankly, the last 25 years have been relatively uneventful in terms of historical significance. Story 64. I think people might look back on this period the way we look back on medieval Europe. They experienced a plague and were dying, but did not understand why it was happening to them, so they shunned the vaccines. All the old diseases returned, and they blamed other factors and continued refusing to get vaccinated. They viewed their leaders like medieval kings, who could act in terrible and foolish ways but needed to be worshipped without question. So I feel a mixture of pity and genuine surprise that any of us managed to survive it all, along with a deep sense of relief that they did not have to endure such dark times, or see us as the decay that led to the fall of Rome. Story 65. Because of climate collapse and other challenges, I don't think we will last long enough for this period to be considered history. Story 66. At any time, they could turn a dial in their cave, and fresh cold water would flow out. They didn't have to risk the searing heat to search in puddles on dried-up riverbeds for drinking water. Story 67. If there is a next time, hopefully people's memory does not fade as quickly, and it will take Republicans another 50 years to gain power, ideally never. Story 68. Hopefully, they say this is why we made a law that requires actual qualifications to be president, not just money and popularity contests. Story 69. It is likely that the genocide in Palestine will eventually be viewed similarly to the Nazi Holocaust. People may not be prepared to frame it that way just yet, but given enough time, many will move past the need for direct comparisons and accept that mass murder, whether through gas chambers or aerial bombardments, is equally horrific. October 7th, along with other acts of Palestinian resistance, will be seen in the context of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Many will come to understand that Israel was responsible for a significant number of civilian deaths while Hamas primarily took prisoners of war. There will also be a growing acknowledgement that Hamas sought to return civilian hostages as soon as possible, but Israel opted for a bombing campaign, resulting in more deaths of prisoners of war and hostages than were freed during the initial hostage negotiations. Story 70. If there are people to look back, it means they will be looking at the end of the bloodthirsty American Empire. Story 71. If we survive long enough for this to become history, it will probably be something like, their arrogance could only be compared to their ignorance. Story 72. Optimistically, a time when they knew better but acted foolishly anyway. Thank goodness we are better now. Realistically, in the past, they read scrolls by a magical light that illuminated every home with the flick of the wrist. Story 73. Americans will be expressing how great things are because they are not allowed to say much else. Everyone else will feel nostalgia for how things used to be and look at Americans with pity while forming alliances for protection from the United States. Story 74. It's the decade of fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Because honestly, MAGA is the fool. Story 75. I guess it all depends on how it works out. Some things could rightfully be looked back on as bad, but some good could come out of it. Story 76. I don't think many people will be left to look back on our past if the politicians in power across the globe don't change. Story 77. He repeatedly crashed the stock market to profit from insider trading and embezzled funds intended for the less fortunate. He cut funding for libraries and health research while maintaining a suspiciously positive stance on Russia. Although he appeared to be an outrageous caricature, he was quite popular at the time. Now, enjoy your meal and begin your shift training the artificial intelligence model that replaces your job. Story 78. I can't believe the United States elected such a foolish person. Though that's what everyone outside the United States is already saying. Story 79. They will ask, if you had a time machine, would you go back in time and take out Trump before he became president of the United States and destroyed America in 2026? This is similar to ridding the earth of Hitler as a young adult before he started World War II. Story 80. The people continued to vote for dictators, believing they could improve their country. History repeats itself. Story 81. The same thing we say when we look back at World War II. How could they stand by while this happened? Why did no one stop it? Story 82. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. For most Americans, the promise of a second chance by a deeply flawed president and his exceptional administration was the return of bold new strategies, reimagined timeless scenarios, and revitalized classic scenes of our glorious republic. For saddened and distraught socialists, communists, and progressives, the struggle to right their capsizing ship became a frenzy as they clawed at one another to capture the reins of their big government hopes and dreams, while drowning one by one in the cold waters of our new freedom. They will not be missed. No, those liberals. Not one bit. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.